sunk until May 1915, so the war fever had not quite started yet when Woods began in April 1914. But he did anticipate that the Germans might send battleships and actually shell the city. So he planned for that. Certainly planned for sabotage, which happened. Worried about Brooklyn catching fire, which is where a lot of the people lived. Hurricanes, because New York had had some big hurricanes. In fact, they had another big one in the 1940s. And of course the riots, which were just as sure as the weather. You would have riots. And the question is, how do you get ready for that? And it consisted of many, many pieces and parts. And so he built for redundancy. Communications. Start with telegraph and telephone. Of course, they had telephones then. Well, what if somebody would attack them, blow them up? So they mapped all the exchanges, and they prepared to have guards there. So every policeman, and he called them in twice in 1916 from vacations. He summoned the whole 11,000-man force on the streets twice in the summer of 1916. So they were prepared to turn out whenever Woods asked them to. And one of those things they might have to do in emergency was guard all the exchanges. So we'll have guards ready. Well, and this is the way Woods thought, well, he can take anything from it. What if somebody blows up the exchanges anyway, or cuts the lines, because those angles of lines do go down occasionally? Well, they got Marconi to give them a wireless set. Well, one wireless set is not enough. You have to have more. So they mapped the location of all the private wireless sets in the city, index cards, addresses, where they would go, and had policemen prepared to go there also. And take them over. Commandeer, that ugly word. That was a key part of Arthur Wood's philosophy. Because, as the Marquis of Pombal saw after Lisbon, is when a city is destroyed, you're on the edge of panic, of riot. And they had that in Lisbon in 1755. They had looters, and the Marquis of Pombal got on top of that. He nationalized food supplies. He hung looters in a series of gallows that he set up, and he had the rich people out there burying the poor people. You turn out everybody, you spare nothing, you spare no one. That was the philosophy of Pombal and the philosophy of Woods. And they also trained operators in Morse code at Fort Wadsworth, which was the big training camp on Staten Island for the New York police. Well, what if the wireless fails? Now, are you kind of getting the idea? His Woods took nothing for granted. He had backups upon backups. Well, there's a thing called the semaphore, which is flag waving used on the Navy. He trained people and equipped them with semaphore flags, sometimes called a wigwag. Well, New York is a very crowded city where they can't see each other. They mapped the rooftops so that people could go up on the rooftops and from the municipal building could pass messages around the city what to do in that emergency. And all those orders had been written up ahead of time, so they didn't have to actually convert a whole long set of pages to flag waving. Instead, it would just say, see document 55-2. And if they needed to get messages out of the city because the wireless was down, they mapped the location of every aircraft and who owned it. And the reporters called this the unconscious auxiliary of New York because the airplane owners didn't even know they were on the list. They didn't know their airplanes would be seized, and probably the pilots as well. Well, that wasn't quite enough either, so Woods also found out where all the factories were and all the repair shops and where all the parts were for the airplanes. And there were hundreds of aircraft even at this time in 1914, most of whom were owned by pretty wealthy people. Tunnels and bridges. Well, he didn't assume that those would stand up. You may remember the picture at the very first. That's the Brooklyn Bridge across the East River. And they had subway tunnels in place, built by guys named sandhogs at great human cost. But he knew that the enemy might well blow those up. So he came up with the first Metropolitan Navy, his name, for the combination of city and state craft as well as hundreds of private craft. And this was a bit more of a public process. It wasn't as much of a secret auxiliary. The boat owners had been warned about it. And in fact, the president of the Erie Railroad actually donated his yacht to the police, called the Alice. The spirit was catching. And And that's really, the Home Defense League gives you an idea of how broadly the city was turning around in a way that nobody expected, with Arthur Woods at the center. It was called the Home Defense League. Later on became an auxiliary as World War I as we declared war in April 1917. 22,000 people. Where did they come from? Well, the street sweepers, they donated a unit or a company, one of which, another one was the produce exchange. The president of the produce exchange came down one day with a police officer in March 1917 and said, "Hey boys, do you want to form a unit with the Defense League?" And they said, "Hurrah!" And they formed, not only immediately signed up to be volunteers in the Home Defense League, which meant drilling, like on a parade ground every 2 weeks and practicing for disasters. They also volunteered to buy a machine gun. They were so fired up. Okay, there's that word commandeer again. Private cars. Of course, lots of private cars in Manhattan and in the other boroughs. And this sounds kind of odd if you read this thing. We're commandeering the private cars, including those who had chauffeurs driving the society women around, like on the Miracle Mile. Is this guy crazy? Or is he going to go totally antagonizing his support? And the answer is no. In fact, the society women had already signed up too. And how much have they signed up? They had trained to be mechanics in the motor corps. And this wasn't an easy, this was 45 hours in the YMCA to learn how to operate and take apart engines. And they had a test. What do you do if a magneto has this behavior? And they would have to diagnose valve problems, take apart the engine in their dusters. And they called them dusters of many hues. So they were prepared to do their bit, really, from the bottom to the top. And you think of that range of skills, it was extraordinary because the whole strata of society, you had people who had grown up on the streets, who knew every kind of street fighting. They were educated by police who had learned judo. You had master hunters who had hunted in Africa, who knew every kind of big bore rifle. You had adventurers, Arctic explorers from the Explorers Club. An amazing range of people solving a range of wicked problems. So refugees, what are we going to do if we lose Brooklyn to fire? Where are these people going to go? Well, he thought about that too. They mapped all the churches and the schools, the auditoriums, the armories, 4 square feet, how many people could be there. And they realized it added up to only 50,000 when you added up all the index cards. In fact, they used cards that were punched by holes so they could sort them quickly. And I'm hoping these cards are still on file somewhere in an archive. I haven't looked at them. They made a list of where all the lumber warehouses were, the canvas, the tools, the stoves, the coal. Well, who would build these things? And he planned on 1 million refugees. City population about 2.5 million at this time. 1 million refugees. Pretty ambitious. Well, he said, well, the citizens will help us build them because we can't possibly build 500 camps holding 2,000 people with just the police and even with the Home Defense League. And the principle is no work, no food. Again, that Marquis de Pombal philosophy, which is this is an all-out emergency and everyone must help, without exception. The food, plans for that. Every bakery in the city on a card. How many stoves it had, how many loaves of bread it could make. They sent the police not just to Fort Wadsworth to learn cooking, but also to Plattsburgh, which was where the National Guard were being trained up for the war. And I assume they had a recipe book, Cooking for 2,000, because each camp was that size. I was a summer camp counselor back as a teenager. We had a book called Cooking for 100. And I thought, boy, those quantities are big. They must have cooked in 55-gallon drums or something. And they had menus made up, 21 different menus with the bills of fare. Now, 1914 through 1918, they never had an all-out emergency. Never had to clear the city. But they did have a number